It is not beyond anyone in this country that we are in a rental crisis. According to a report by Everybody's Home, you would need to earn $130,000 a year to not be in rental stress. And yet, while everyone is understandably talking about housing, supply, demand, there is one small thing that a lot of people aren't really talking about: rental bonds. We're here with our resident renter. Renter, can you tell me what a bond is?
The money I give my landlord before I break stuff?
Awesome. Well, kind of. Despite what you might think, unless you live in the Northern Territory, your landlord doesn't actually hold your bond. To those who don't know, a bond is a payment you make to your landlord, usually equivalent to about 4 weeks of rent, as a sort of insurance or security policy that, to quote our renter, ensures you won't break stuff. If you did break a bunch of stuff in your rental, the landlord can use that bond or payment to fix the stuff you broke. If you didn't break a bunch of stuff, you get the money back when you move out. But like I said, the landlord doesn't actually hold the bond. Rather, the bond is lodged with whichever government of the state or territory you're in. So here in Victoria, the government has what's called the Residential Tenancies Bond Authority, which holds all of our state's rental bonds in a trust.
And historically, it was held by the landlord, sometimes in their top drawer, sometimes in their back pocket.
This is Leo Patterson Ross. He's the head of the Tenants Union New South Wales, and as such, he's been speaking a lot about the bond system for the past few years.
In the 70s, we started to see this change where the bonds started to be held by government authorities. And in New South Wales, for instance, from 79, the law was if a landlord took a bond, they had to put that into the rental bond board, who held it in trust until the end of the tenancy, and they released it. So if government's holding it, it's more secure, but it's also then can be used, it is generating interest, it's a financial asset, someone's going to get the benefit of it, and they invest it and they use that to fund various bits of the renting system. And the bond board is legislated to say what they can do with that money.
As Leo said, respective state and territory governments hold renters' money in a trust, and they generate interest using that, presumably your money. They might even invest it, though we don't know where. Adding it all together, state and territory governments collectively hold about $5.2 billion in rental bonds that they earn money from. Now, the issue is that we don't actually know where a lot of this money goes.
Now, we don't actually have really good visibility of how they're investing it, but we know, for instance, that there's a similar fund called One Fund that the New South Wales government is starting to set up to hold these sort of similar kinds of finances that the government often manages on behalf of the communities. And in that fund, they're aiming, over a 10-year period, they're aiming to earn 4.5% more than whatever the CPI is over that time. So it's a pretty decent return. It's probably like 7 to 8% a year that they're earning on these pools of money that are often in the billions of dollars. But even if you account for keeping some of that available for use, you've still got nearly $2 billion available to invest, to earn money. And so we calculate that they should be earning about 100 to 130 million a year. But the government is only sending back to the bond board about 70 million a year to spend on the various things that it's legislated to spend on.
Just to reiterate, if you're a renter and you live in New South Wales, we don't know where $30 to $60 million of your money, remember this is your money the government is holding onto just in case your landlord finds a bug in the house, we don't know where that money is going. If we extrapolate that nationally, state and territory governments collectively generate around $450 million in interest from tenants' bonds every year. For context, the federal government's Housing Australia Future Fund, its centrepiece housing policy, was originally projected to generate $500 million a year through returns on investment. So sure, we don't know where a lot of this money goes, but we can still track down some of it.
There's 15 million goes to the tribunal to hear matters. Now, those matters are mostly actually evictions of tenants. So tenants are funding the tribunal and subsidizing the tribunal to evict other tenants. It is also where tenants go to get repairs orders and so on, but the volume of cases is overwhelmingly around eviction.
It's arguably worse and more opaque here in Victoria, where $1.5 billion in rental bonds reportedly generates around $41 million annually. Of that, $13 million is put into the Residential Tenancies Fund, which itself is used to fund tribunals, and another $13 million mostly goes to outsourced firms and consultants. Now, it's not all bad in New South Wales. $15 million goes towards the Tenants Advice and Advocacy Program, which provides tenancy advice and advocacy services to renters. However, as put by Leo,
it's often not been at a level that's needed for the volume of renters in New South Wales. There's nearly 1 million renting households in New South Wales, and there's often been, 10 to 15 enforcement officers to try and cover that whole area. And that's one of the reasons why we see non-compliance with the law, is that there isn't really this kind of active and visible regulator. So if that money was being spent on that, that'd be good too.
And it's just obvious that despite tenant advocacy groups getting similar funding to tribunal hearings for evictions, at least in New South Wales, there are just way more tenants than landlords, so there's much less funding per tenant. And this isn't even to mention the private funding that goes into the typical landlord's operations, which just completely dwarfs that of tenants.
So we've been campaigning for a while for a significant increase to the tenants advice service funding, but we're still talking about going from 16 or so million a year up to about 25, 26 million a year. When you compare that to the amount that is that landlords are using to hire agents, which is almost $1 billion a year, we are talking about a really big gap in the different sort of services provided to the different people within the system.
But outside of the fact that the money of renters is being used to generate returns through interest and other investments, and those returns aren't being sufficiently funneled back into things that would help said renters, there are more structural, even fundamental problems with our renting system. According to a report by law firm Arnica Legal on their casework, more than 4 in 5 landlord bond claims were found to be at least in part spurious. That means that many landlords are just artificially increasing the amount in bond you have to pay up front when you first start to rent. Now, the reason why a landlord would do this is because when the tenant moves out, there's more money to claim for potential damages, and these claims can get very arbitrary. Before, we mentioned that a landlord tried to claim part of their tenant's bond because they found a single cockroach in their house. Arnica Legal mentions a landlord that tried to claim a cleaning fee based on a single hair on the floor, and this seems like a very pervasive practice and culture amongst the landlord class in this country.
So, within the renting system, there's this assumption often in the law that the two parties are equal and they have the capacity to negotiate and discuss things and then go to the tribunal and have that be the arbiter, but on a fairly equal footing. And that's just not the experience that renters actually have for a number of reasons. But just in terms of the actual time and energy able to be put in, like we're talking about, on one hand, an investor who is receiving rent from the tenants, as well as the capital gain in the property, and they're doing it to make money. It may not be their full-time job, but they have resources coming in that they can then use within that. And one of the things that they expend those resources on is hiring an agent to do all the various bits of being a property investor that they don't have time for or energy for. Whereas tenants are generally having to do this stuff themselves. If they're in a dispute, if they're organizing things, if they're running around organizing access or cleaners or so on, they're doing that all on their own. And so there is this sort of imbalance because of the transfer, basically, of the finances from one party to the other, that then lets them afford more assistance in resolving any dispute.
Like Leo says, there's no real way to gauge a specific number because most renters aren't willing or able to take their landlord to court. As mentioned, and as you can probably imagine, the average landlord is much more well-resourced than the average tenant. So these disputes, whether it be at the start or at the end of the lease, are inherently tilted in favor of the landlord. So it seems that in every way, from structural inequalities and imbalances to literally the interest and returns earned from the bond money of tenants, some of which is spurious, it is a landlord's market and it's a landlord's government. Over half of the politicians in the New South Wales Parliament own multiple properties, and federally on average, MPs own 2 properties. To quote Leo here in The Guardian, it is clear that owning properties can influence politicians' decision making. Now in New South Wales, Labor actually banned all donations from property, so theoretically you might say they're free from that influence, but this hasn't stopped developers and investors from trying to influence government in other ways. As reported here, developers and investors can donate to the government through putting money into otherwise unrelated projects. But even beyond this instrumentalist way of analysing the propertied influence in Australian politics, I think fundamentally there is a pervasive idea in Australia that home ownership, whether it be one or multiple, is the main path to success and stability. That attitude is reflected in our governments, irrespective of which political party is in power.
Both Labor and Liberal, their basic position is that we should be a primarily ownership focused housing system, and that they put ownership on a pedestal and privilege it in a range of ways. And in a fairly consensus-driven way. They have differences on particular policies, but at the end of the day, I think they are ultimately seeking ownership as the goal for all Australians, but it plays out in a way that's unhealthy for a housing system. So, but that's something that's ultimately, again, supported by both parties, and we haven't yet seen kind of a deviation from ownership as the goal. And that's partly the political economy of Australia, because everyone culturally has been kind of brought up and sort of trained to think that that's the way. So obviously their politicians will kind of represent that. But over time, as the housing system gets worse, it's probably we're going to see some change there.
This hegemonic culture of prioritizing and centering real estate and ownership goes way back. In the first 4 decades of the 20th century, the Commonwealth and states all established major programs for promoting mass home ownership. And as noted by Leo, this is unhealthy. It paradoxically began to leave more and more people out of the Australian dream. This isn't the first time, of course, that this embellishment of property ownership was its own downfall. Back in the 1930s, it became clear that merely promoting home ownership through subsidized finance was not adequate to the task of solving the country's housing crises. State governments reluctantly succumbed to pressure from the working class and middle class social reformers to provide public housing. It is from these inequalities and crises which we can then hope to act, as put by the Unemployed Workers Union of the 1930s, who were at the forefront of fighting the housing crisis back then. United we stand, but divided we fall. And this first step to uniting as a class, as a people, to then act and force governments to respond, is to talk.
But I think actually sharing experiences and sharing the frustrations that people feel with friend groups, with local groups, with more organized groups is useful, because then you start to realize that it's not actually you that's in a unique position and finding it difficult. It is something that is a more systemic problem. So sharing those experiences with other people who are also experiencing it is just healthy for you mentally. You lighten the load that you're kind of carrying. And people will offer support. The formal services that are around the country, so the Tenants Union New South Wales and the Tenants Advice Services, we offer sort of some ability for people to join in. You can certainly be members of someone like the Tenants Union, and you can volunteer and assist other renters with advice. And there's similar programs in other states and territories. We also have events where people can come and share those stories. But even if there's not something in your local area, being online in Facebook groups, looking for other people, and then starting a discussion there, moving into the real world can be a really useful thing, and it's where a lot of groups have come from over time. There are different groups across the country as well who, take different political kinds of actions or political views of how to fix things. And so places like the Renters and Housing Union are a really, exciting development. They are much more of the sort of that evolution of grassroots. They really came out of a response to COVID and feeling really frustrated at the way that government was responding. So, people should find their tribe, the people who are feeling the same as them, and also feeling like the solutions might be things that they can join in on. Even just offering support to a person who's going through a hard time can be really, really valuable to that person, but also to you as part of a community.
Housing is one of the biggest questions that we face today, and it's imperative that a grassroots organisation revolves around these things. On the 2nd of August here in Melbourne, there is going to be a big demonstration against the privatisation and demolition of the inner city public housing towers. It's organised in part by the Renters and Housing Union, Rahu. It can be a great point to start being involved and connect with people who are likewise struggling from the current housing crisis. Get down, get involved, and demand action from the government.